Welcome back to Organize with Grace podcast. If you're ready to declutter your life and home so that you can make room for peace in your heart, you're in the right place. Join me, Grace Ramon, your host and home organizer, where I and my guests share tips and encouragement to help you get started, especially when you don't know where to start. I'm here with you as you begin your decluttering journey, so let's get going. You ready? Decluttering and downsizing is a whole lot more than just the stuff. And because it goes beyond the stuff, we need a whole lot of grace instead of perfectionism. And that is what we are going to talk about today, and how it relates to decluttering and downsizing. Give yourself grace. I have heard this statement a lot from an organizer that I learned so much from. And she has a podcast and I listened to it for years, especially when I was first starting out with my organizing business. So back then I would hear it, but it wouldn't register in my brain. What does she mean by that? And then she went on to say that it's better to focus on progress and not perfection. So in the last episode, we dove into this concept, actually this truth of grace. So I want to revisit it. So last episode, though, was with Dana K. White, and I talked to her about her new book called Jesus Doesn't Care About Your Messy House. And we talked a lot about grace and what that looks like. And I felt the need to extend that topic to you to encourage you in your decluttering journey, especially when it feels frustrating, when it feels like you're not going anywhere with it or it's difficult to get started. Now let's take a look at what the definition is of grace. And there's one that I want to focus on. So it's defined in the Webster Dictionary as unmerited divine assistance given to humans for their regeneration or sanctification. And I went down the list and I want to focus in on the other definition, which is disposition to or an act of instance of kindness, courtesy, or clemency. So this means that coming from a position of grace for ourselves mean that we are to treat ourselves with kindness, courtesy, or clemency. See, grace knows that we are human and have limits, especially as we age. Grace knows that we get tired, we lose motivation, and are emotional beings. But then, on the other hand, perfectionism will tell us a little bit, or perhaps a lot, of a different story. We do the opposite often, don't we? Let me explain further. Have you ever talked to yourself this way or had these thoughts within your mind? Let's start with one. Why can't I get it together? This decluttering thing seems so easy for others, but not me. And here's another one. Why am I struggling so much with letting go? There must be something wrong with me. Or, I shouldn't get this emotional about material things. And then here's one more. You expect to make the right decisions about every single possession. Any of this sound familiar? You may not have uttered this outright, of course, not word for word, but the feelings and the idea behind it, it has probably bubbled up in your heart or in your mind. Now, we berate ourselves and we set such high expectations of ourselves, and then we're so quick to discredit ourselves. Oh my goodness, what a crazy cycle, right? I've done the same thing. And when we do this, we are operating from perfectionism. So in a nutshell, perfectionism, which is defined as a disposition to regard anything short of perfection, is unacceptable. And I've heard clients say things like, why can't I get this right? I'm fill in the blank about how old they are. I'm this old and I still don't know how to do this. Or they will say something like, I'm feeling behind. Or other people manage without being emotional. Why can't I? Therefore, our minds get tainted with pressure, with doubt, comparison, feelings of not being good enough. Now, let's get back to grace. That word grace, the meaning of it. Instead, it says, you are valued regardless of what you accomplish. So with grace, it says that our worth, our value is not tied to our performance. And that mistakes are just mistakes. They're not failures. We're not a failure. Instead, mistakes are opportunities. And on the other hand, perfectionism's like, nope, I am a failure. Anything less than the ideal is unacceptable. So do you see how perfectionism creates those rigid standards and then it leaves no room for human limitations or the natural messiness of life transitions? Let me tell you about a client we recently had. She didn't feel like she was moving fast enough with downsizing. She was getting help with other things, but getting those heavy boxes out and having to go through them, the lifting is just too much for her. And she is currently taking care of her husband who had been recovering from a very significant health issue. And this is what I told her. You're doing wonderful, and I love that you started as early as you did. You are ahead of the game. She was like, really? And I said, yes, because she was planning early. She had started to take action early, and they wanted to move by summertime. And I love that she had it in mind to get started now. And she didn't, she was surprised to learn that she was ahead of the game. And I felt like that was what she needed to hear at that point. She expressed stress about the process, and I reminded her that she is doing great. So the grace we give ourselves isn't about lowering standards or making excuses. Rather, it's about approaching ourselves with compassion and understanding, especially during challenging life transitions like downsizing. So with all of this, I invite you, give yourself more grace. Now, for the practicals, let's check out 3 ways that you can shift your mental script so that you can operate from and be motivated by a place of grace instead of pressure and perfectionism. Starting with number 1, celebrate what is already done. So instead of walking into your space saying or thinking, oh my gosh, I still have so much to sort through. Instead, you can say, oh, look, I've started a donation pile. If indeed you've started one, that's great. And then instead of saying, I haven't touched that garage yet, try this. I've completely cleared out the guest bedroom, right? And that's a lot more than like positive thinking. But I think also it's more about acknowledging reality from a perspective of grace. So when we recognize what we've already done, we build confidence in our ability to continue. Number 2, we must honor the emotional journey. We've got to really recognize and acknowledge the complex emotions that we're going to feel, because trust me, it will come up. It comes up every time I work with a client, and I consider it very normal. I've seen it over and over even with myself, when I'm trying to let go of things. But you know what perfectionism tells us? Like, we shouldn't feel sad. Listen to grace instead. Yeah, listen to the word grace and listen to me, Grace. Because grace tells us that these feelings are not only normal, but important and worth addressing. So try setting aside a space and time to honor these emotions. And maybe that looks like taking photos of meaningful items before letting them go. Maybe it's even journaling if you like to write, and journaling the memories attached to certain spaces or certain items in your home before transitioning to a new home. We must give ourselves permission to feel. That's being human. And sometimes it's challenging. We would rather dismiss it or rather suppress it or escape from it. I know it's super challenging. But moving through our emotions feels hard, but I feel it's harder when we do ignore them. Go ahead and acknowledge that it's hard because it is, and that it's okay. I feel like that creates even more forward momentum than when we pretend that it's easy. I've had moments with clients where I sensed that emotionally they were getting overwhelmed, and I would say, hey, let's take a break. Let's take a few minutes, grab a snack, drink of water, go outside, what have you. And I invite you to do the same for you. Number 3, find your enough point. What does that mean? So this third approach is to really be clear of what enough progress looks like for you. And let it not be based on external standards. Like, yes, it's definitely always nice to have a goal. Like, okay, I'm going to clear out this room in the next week, or I'm going to clean out this closet this weekend. But what I mean is that focus on what truly deserves your current life circumstance. For example, if you are downsizing while caring for an ill spouse, like my client is, your enough will look different than someone with different responsibilities. And a lot of times you are processing grief alongside downsizing, grief of any level, whether that be grieving the sickness of a loved one or grieving the death of a loved one. Your timeline will naturally adjust, so you don't have to give yourself such a rigid timeline necessarily. Again, like I said, goals are good unless there's a safety issue involved where you need to be somewhere where you can be safe at home. So the things that I mentioned today are for those who have time to do this. So meaning you have 6 months to downsize, you have a year to downsize, and not necessarily for those who have to do this suddenly where there is an event. Like a client I had, they had a fall and the doctor determined that they could no longer live alone. So daughter contacted us to try to pack her belongings because they weren't able to pack it at that time. They had to simply swoop her up and pick her up and have her move closer to the family. So all of these things that I am sharing are for those who do have time, who are able to take your time with downsizing. In review, 1, focus on accomplishments, big or small, doesn't matter. Number 2, honor your emotions. Number 3, find your enough point. The truth is, I know you still want to do an excellent job. You've succeeded in so many things in life, and you are no excuse maker. And grace is really about treating yourself with the same kindness you'd show a friend who's going through a tough time. When we take the time to celebrate the small wins, make room for those emotions, because yes, they're going to come up, and figuring out what enough means for our unique situations, the whole decluttering thing becomes so much lighter. Downsizing becomes a lot easier. Perfectionism, on the other hand, that's the voice telling you that your worth is tied to how much you get done, that mistakes means you've failed, and that anything less than perfect isn't good enough. But Grace understands that we're human. Grace understands we have limits. Grace sees all that progress you're making, even when you yourself cannot see it. So this week, when you start feeling overwhelmed by all the stuff, just take a breath and tell yourself, I am giving myself grace. Because honestly, the peace you're really looking for isn't in having the perfect space. It's in giving yourself the permission to be perfectly human. One last thing, I would love to know which approach you want to try for yourself this week. You can either email me, grace@organizewithgrace.com, and we can email back and forth about it. Let's chat. Or you can also find me on Instagram. That's where I like to hang out, at Organize with Grace. Over there, I'll put in a link in the podcast description. Thank you so much for listening today. I had been really wanting to record this podcast, and I am so glad that I finally was able to do it. So until next time, grace to you.